The best schools, the finest opportunities of life, completely free from the financial hardships his mother and I had clawed through. In those early years, I made sure he had all of it. But there, I sat tucked in the corner of that lavish dining room at the Magnolia Ridge Country Club for his wedding rehearsal dinner, and the truth settled over me like a stone. I hadn't raised a man. I had bankrolled a monster. The room radiated money from every surface. Crystal chandeliers poured warm golden light down onto tables adorned with hothouse gardenias. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here today. If these stories of quiet strength and hard-earned justice mean something to you, a like and a subscription go a long way toward keeping them coming. Before we get into today's story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What do you hope to walk away feeling after a story like this one? Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. It's the message underneath that truly matters. I sat quietly near the back of the room, dressed in the same navy blue suit I had worn to Evelyn's funeral, clean pressed, but no one was going to mistake it for anything fashionable. Across that glittering space, Derek sat beside his bride, Natalie. She was 30 years old, all sharp angles and calculated beauty, her smile the kind that stops well short of the eyes. She held court with her bridesmaids, her voice carrying cleanly over the smooth, big band music playing in the background. I cannot believe he actually pulled that battered 12-year-old pickup into the valet line. Natalie laughed, lifting her champagne flute. It is like a janitor wandered into a black tie gala. I already told Derek his father needs to stay out of frame tomorrow. I will not have that shabby look contaminating my wedding photos. Her bridesmaids obliged with laughter. I sat there, palms flat on the white tablecloth, a cold knot tightening in my chest. I looked at Derek, my own son, the boy I had steadied on a bicycle, the boy I had sat beside through fevers and nightmares. He was right there, wineglass in hand, and he heard every syllable. He said nothing, just a weak, fidgeting laugh, and then he looked away. That silence cut deeper than anything Natalie could have said herself. What Natalie did not know, what Derek had gone out of his way to conceal from her, was exactly how this extravagant weekend had been paid for. 2 months earlier, Derek had shown up at my door, close to tears, telling me his investments had collapsed and he could not cover the wedding costs. To spare him the shame, I quietly wired $8,000, enough to handle the venue, the catering, the flowers, and the open bar. Derek turned around and told Natalie and her parents that he had funded it all from a windfall in cryptocurrency. I let him take the credit because I loved him. I told myself I was protecting his dignity. What I had actually done was buy myself a front row seat to my own humiliation. When dinner ended, Derek caught my eye across the room and tilted his head toward the mahogany-paneled hallway outside the banquet doors. Like a fool, my heart rose. I thought he was coming to apologize. I thought he wanted to pull me aside, thank me quietly for the $8,000, and tell me he was sorry for what Natalie had said. "Dad, listen," Derek said, pacing the length of the hallway carpet, his hands working nervously. "We have a situation." Natalie looked over the honeymoon itinerary, and the standard overwater bungalow in St. Lucia is not going to work. All her friends are booked at the premium resort on the far side of the island. I need you to wire another $15,000 by tomorrow morning so I can lock in the upgrade. I studied his face, searching for some trace of the boy I had raised. "You were asking me for another $15,000, I said, keeping my voice quiet and level. "After I just paid $8,000 for a wedding, you are telling everyone you paid for yourself." Derek ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Come on, Dad. You live in a small house and drive a truck that belongs in a salvage yard. You barely touch your money. What are you sitting on it for? This is my wedding, the most important week of my life. I am not wiring you another cent, Derek," I said. "It is time you learn to live within what you have." His expression shifted, the panic drained away, and something colder moved in behind it. "You know, Natalie warned me about this," he said, his tone going sharp and ugly. "She said your cognitive decline was making you paranoid and stingy. Fine. Keep your money, old man, but don't expect us to show up and play happy family when you're sitting alone in that house." He turned and walked straight back into the party, leaving me standing in the empty hallway. Cognitive decline. The phrase rang in my ears. He was already building his explanation, already framing my refusal to be his personal bank as a symptom of deterioration. I needed air. I could not walk back into that dining room and look at those people. I turned and pushed through the heavy doors leading to the venue's kitchen. The moment they swung shut behind me, the polished elegance of the evening gave way to the raw, glorious noise of a working kitchen, screaming burners, shouting line cooks, the crash and clatter of a full service in motion. Everything stopped the instant I stepped inside. The executive chef, a big man named Garrett, wiped his hands on his apron and came straight over. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice carrying real reverence. "What an honor, sir. Is everything to your satisfaction? Can I set up a private table for you in the back?" I smiled and shook my head. "The food is outstanding as always, Garrett. I just needed somewhere quiet to breathe. Carry on, everyone?" The kitchen staff nodded and returned to work. This was the second thing Derek had no idea about. When Evelyn and I were starting out, we opened a small diner. Over 40 years of hard work, careful investing, and a lifestyle far beneath our means, that diner became something else entirely. Today, my private holding company controls a wide empire of hospitality and real estate across the state. I don't merely visit the Magnolia Ridge Country Club. My holding company owns the entire catering and hospitality group that runs it. Every chef, every manager in that building works for me. I choose to wear old clothes and drive a worn-out truck because I never lost sight of where I began. Real wealth is quiet. It's the people with a little money who feel the need to announce it. I was standing in the corner of the kitchen, nursing a glass of water, when the swinging doors flew open. Natalie's swept-in cheeks flushed and furious, a crystal wine glass gripped in her hand. She went straight for a young waitress who looked barely old enough to be out of school. "Are you completely incompetent?" Natalie's voice bounced off the stainless steel walls. "I asked for a dry Pinot Grigio and you brought me a Chardonnay. Do you have any idea what my husband is paying you? People to be here? You are absolutely useless." The girl's eyes filled with tears, her apology stumbling out in fragments. Natalie shoved the glass into her chest, sloshing wine across her uniform, and turned and left. Garrett looked at me from across the kitchen, his face gone pale. He knew exactly what I had just seen. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I put a hand on Garrett's shoulder and walked out through the back into the cool night air. The last piece had fallen into place. This was not simply an ungrateful son. This was two people who believed that access to my money entitled them to treat working people as less than human. The next morning, wedding day, the air hummed with nerves and heavy floral perfume. I arrived early and settled in the grand lobby outside the bridal suite. The doors swung open and Natalie emerged, already complaining loudly into her phone about the makeup artist. When she spotted me in the chair, her face arranged itself into undisguised irritation. She ended the call and crossed the floor toward me, silk robe sweeping behind her arms, folding across her chest. "Gerald, let's get one thing understood before this ceremony begins," she said. "I have spoken with the photographer and the wedding planner. You will be seated in the 5th row during the ceremony, not the front." I looked up at her without moving. "The father of the groom traditionally sits in the front row, Natalie. Not when he refuses to dress appropriately," she said, voice clipped. "Derek told me you wouldn't help with the honeymoon. If you're going to be a stubborn, cheap old man, you can sit in the back with the distant relatives. I will not have your look ruining the front row of my photographs. Are we clear? This is it." I looked at this woman, the woman my son had chosen, and felt something unexpected move through me. The hurt was gone. In its place was a still sharp clarity. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and drew out a thick, white envelope. I held it toward her. Natalie's eyes went straight to it, lit from within by pure, unguarded greed. She assumed it held the $15,000 Derek had demanded the night before. She pulled it from my hand, with a triumphant little smile settling across her face. "I'm glad you finally came to your senses, Gerald," she said, tapping the envelope against her palm. "Sit in the 5th row. Keep quiet and try not to embarrass us." I rose slowly from the chair. "Enjoy your wedding, Natalie." I turned and headed back toward the banquet hall. She had no idea what she had actually taken. That envelope held no money, just a voided check and a handwritten note, the opening move, in a sequence that would bring about her total destruction. The trap was already laid. All I had to do was wait for the reception. The grand ballroom of the Magnolia Ridge Country Club was a monument to extravagance. Crystal glasses clinked beneath the surging sound of a 12-piece live orchestra, playing songs I had never once heard. Arrangements of white calla lilies towered on every table, climbing so high that guests had to lean sideways just to see the person across from them. I had been assigned to table 16 exactly where Natalie had placed me. It was jammed into the far back corner, right against the kitchen's swinging doors. Every time a server came through, a surge of hot air rolled out carrying the smell of pork chops and roasted potatoes. The other guests at table 16 were distant relatives from Natalie's side of the family. They spent the entire evening complaining about the humidity and offered me not a single glance. That was perfectly fine by me. I sat in my faded suit working through a glass of iced water and studying the room. Derek was across the hall laughing too loudly with his groomsmen, a glass of scotch in hand that likely cost more than my first automobile. He looked the part in his tailored tuxedo, but there was a driven, restless quality beneath it. He was performing playing a self-made man of wealth to a room full of people whose only interest was the number in his account. I knew the reality behind the act. His accounts were bare. He was neck-deep in debt. The only thing standing between him and complete ruin was a sacrifice I had made without ever asking for recognition. I kept my silence and went on watching. Waiters moved through the crowd in fluid practice lines, and each time one passed my table, they offered me a quiet, knowing nod. They were well aware of who owned the company that signed their checks. The music slowed into a soft, romantic number, and couples began drifting to the dance floor. I was cutting through my meal at a slow, deliberate pace when I caught sight of her. Natalie was making her way between the tables, her sweeping white gown grazing every chair in its path. The white envelope I had given her that morning was locked in her right hand, her knuckles pale with the force of her grip. She moved through the room with the practiced warmth of a glowing bride, smiling and nodding at guests as she passed. But when the distance between us closed and she reached table 16, her eyes found mine, and every trace of that warmth disappeared. What was left was pure, unfiltered contempt. She moved with deliberate intent, stepping past the suddenly silent relatives at my table and leaning down close to my ear, keeping her voice beneath the music. The dense cloud of her perfume pressed in from all sides. "What kind of sick joke is this?" she hissed, her voice a low, cutting whisper. She snapped the envelope down onto the table beside my water glass. The flap had been torn open. The voided check was visible inside, along with the handwritten note that read simply, "Respect is earned, not bought." She moved closer, her manicured nails pressing into the tablecloth. "You think you're so clever, Gerald," she spat. "You think this makes some kind of point. Derek told me you were holding back the honeymoon money because your mind is going, but this is not dementia. This is just pathetic. You are a cheap, bitter old man who cannot stand to see his son happy." I looked at the voided check. Then I looked at her. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I lifted the cloth napkin from my lap and quietly wiped my mouth. "Natalie, there is a very expensive party happening all around you," I said calmly. "A party you did not pay for. I suggest you go enjoy it." My composure appeared to pour fuel on her fury. The red rising in her face pushed through the layers of makeup. "Do not speak to me as though I am one of your uneducated truck-driving friends," she sneered. "You have been an embarrassment from the moment you walked through those doors. Look at yourself. You look like someone who wandered in off the street. You are dragging down my wedding with that cheap suit and your sour attitude. Derek is ashamed of you, and honestly, I cannot say I blame him. He told me he hates bringing you around my parents because you have absolutely no class." Those words were engineered to cut. She wanted to watch me shatter, to see the look on a father's face the moment he learns his own son is ashamed of him. But that pain had already run its course the night before. What remained in its place was colder and far more purposeful. "I am sure Derek has said a great many things, Natalie." I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "But class has nothing to do with the clothes on your back or the car in your driveway. Class is how you treat people when you believe you hold all the power. And you have given me a very thorough demonstration of that." She let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Who I am the woman who is taking your son far away from your pitiful little life. We do not need your honeymoon upgrade money. Derek has more than enough from his investments. We do not need you at all, Gerald. The only reason you are even sitting at this table is because I took pity on you. I wanted to give you a chance to show you could fit into our world. Instead, you proved exactly the opposite. You are just a stingy old fool who believes a piece of paper gives him some kind of authority." I let my gaze move across the room. Derek was at the bar watching us. He could see his new wife leaning over my table, radiating fury. He could see me sitting there, absorbing every word. And just as he had the night before, he turned away. He took a sip of his scotch and laughed at whatever someone said to him. His choice was being made in plain sight. I brought my attention back to the bride. Her breathing had grown uneven, her eyes alight with a hatred that crowded the space between us. "You are right about one thing, Natalie," I said, my voice dropping to a low, even tone. "This voided check does not make me powerful. It was a test to see whether you would choose family over a luxury vacation, a test to see if my son would stand up for his father. You both failed." She straightened one hand, smoothing the bodice of her gown. Her face hardened into an expression of cold, unvarnished contempt. "I am done playing games with you, Gerald," she said softly, each word threaded with malice. "You have embarrassed Derek for the last time." I glanced past her toward the bar. Derek's back was fully turned to us now, absorbed in conversation with a groomsman, deliberately completely absent. He was choosing to let his wife humiliate his father in a room full of strangers. He had exchanged his own flesh and blood for the illusion of a life he had not earned. The boy I had raised was no longer there. The man standing at that bar was a stranger to me. A deep, quiet grief moved through me, not for the son I was losing that day, but for the son I had already lost long ago without ever noticing. Natalie caught me looking at Derek and let out a soft, cutting laugh. "Don't bother looking his way, Gerald. He is not coming to help you. He does not care about you. Do you want to know what he said to me last night after you refused to pay for our honeymoon upgrade? He said he cannot wait until you finally pass away, so we can sell that little house of yours and put the money towards something that actually matters. He is just waiting for the inheritance. That is all you are to him, a waiting game." The sheer brutality of it settled over the table. She had said it with the triumphant smile of someone who believes she had just delivered a killing blow. She wanted to see me collapse. She wanted tears. What she had actually done was set me free. Every last shred of guilt I had been carrying about what was coming dissolved in that instant. They had constructed their own destruction stone by stone through limitless greed and a total absence of human decency. I owed them absolutely nothing, no loyalty, no cover, and certainly no more of my money. "You are remarkably sure of yourself, Natalie," I said, my voice low and unhurried. "You stand in this beautiful ballroom, drinking imported champagne, eating a premium meal, and you believe you have claimed the world. You look at these crystal chandeliers and these tuxedoed waiters, and you are convinced this luxury is yours by right. You think you have lifted yourself above people like me." She drew herself up, eyes sharp, with arrogant certainty. "I do not just think it, Gerald. I know it. Look around you. This is my world now. This is the standard of living I deserve. Derek and I belong in places like the Magnolia Ridge Country Club. We belong among the elite, and you belong in that worn-out truck sitting in the back lot. You are a relic, Gerald. You are a reminder of a past Derek is working so hard to leave behind." I took a slow sip of my iced water, savoring the deep irony of her speech. She was holding forth about her place among the elite, while standing inside a building owned outright by the very man she was mocking. Every waiter attending to her, every chef behind those kitchen doors, every manager keeping her evening seamless, all of them answered ultimately to me. The ground beneath her feet belonged to my holding company. She was a guest in my house, lecturing me about not belonging. "I am done wasting words on you," she went on, her tone sharpening with each sentence. "I have a wedding to enjoy. I have hundreds of important guests who deserve my attention. People who actually matter. People who will not drag down my social standing simply by being near me." She stepped back and leveled a perfectly manicured finger at my face. "Let me make this very simple for you, Gerald. You are going to leave. You are going to get up, walk through those doors, climb into that miserable truck of yours, and drive back to whatever hollow, lonely life you came from. You will not eat the food at this event. You will not drink the wine, and you will absolutely not appear in any of our family photographs." I set my water glass down on the table. The ice shifted softly against the crystal. The distant relatives at my table had stopped even pretending not to listen. They were watching openly now, riveted by the bride's escalating demands. "Are you telling me to leave my own son's wedding, Natalie?" I asked, my voice carrying no trace of anger. "I am not telling you, I am ordering you." She snapped her voice, climbing just enough to pull a few more heads in our direction. "You are a toxic, embarrassing presence, and I will not allow you to ruin my night any further. You are cut off, Gerald, from us, from our future children, from everything." She swept a hand dramatically toward the heavy oak doors at the far end of the banquet hall. "Get out of here and do not come back. You are not welcome here," she snarled. The The music seemed to recede into the distance as those words settled over the table. Get out. You are not welcome here. It was total rejection handed down with maximum cruelty. She stood before me, chest rising and falling, waiting for my response. She expected argument. She expected pleading. Maybe she was hoping I would make a scene so she could have security remove me and spend the rest of the night playing the wronged victim for her well-heeled guests. Instead, I did the opposite of every single thing she anticipated. I folded my cloth napkin and laid it neatly beside my untouched plate. I drew in a slow breath, feeling the cool air of the ballroom fill my chest. I placed both hands on the armrests of my chair and rose to my feet in a single unhurried motion. I was taller than Natalie, and as I came to my full height, she took a small, instinctive step backward, though she fought to hold her aggressive posture. I looked down at her. No glare, no frown. Just a quiet, knowing smile, the expression of a man holding every card in the deck, while watching his opponent confidently present a losing hand. I reached down and fastened the center button of my faded suit jacket, smoothed the lapels, and brushed away an invisible speck of lint. I felt entirely, completely free. The weight of trying to purchase my son's love had lifted from my shoulders. The obligation to shield him from the fallout of his own arrogance was gone. You are right, Natalie. I said, my voice warm, almost gentle. I truly do not belong at this table. Her smug, victorious smile came flooding back. She folded her arms, certain she had won the decisive battle, that she had successfully expelled the embarrassing father-in-law and cemented her standing in polite society. I am glad you finally understand, she said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. Now leave. I gave her one final pleasant nod. All right, I replied quietly, but I will be taking some others with me. I turned my back on her bewildered face and began walking not toward the front exit where her finger had pointed, but directly toward the swinging kitchen doors. The real reception was about to begin, and I was the one holding the baton. I walked away from Natalie and took one measured breath. The deep pulse of the wedding band moved through the hardwood floor beneath my shoes. Around the room, guests laughed and raised their champagne flutes, entirely unaware of the quiet upheaval that was seconds away. Behind me, Natalie radiated a self-satisfied glow. She was convinced she had just scored a decisive win by expelling a tired old man from her flawless social occasion. In her mind, I was already in the parking lot, climbing into my worn truck, licking my wounds in private. I could almost feel her triumphant smirk tracking the back of my neck. But I did not go anywhere near the main lobby doors. I walked straight toward the polished mahogany doors of the catering kitchen. That contrast, the gleaming excess of the ballroom against the raw, functional energy on the other side of those doors, had always struck me. I pushed through and stepped into the bright fluorescent light of the kitchen. The heat of the commercial ovens rolled over me, carrying the dense, rich smell of roasting garlic. Dozens of chefs, line cooks, and servers moved through their choreographed routines, plating secondary courses, assembling the dessert tiers. Standing at the central prep station was Raymond, the venue's general manager. Raymond had been with my holding company for nearly 15 years. He was precise, thorough, and understood every corner of my corporate operations. He looked up the moment I came through the door and immediately set down the towel he was holding, stepping away from the prep line with an expression of quiet concern, reading something in the way I was carrying myself. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice low and measured. "Is everything all right out in the dining room? Would you like a private space set up?" I shook my head, holding his gaze. "Lemon," I said, my voice level, but carrying a weight that brought him to full attention. "The groom and his bride have just informed me that I am no longer welcome at this establishment. They have instructed me to vacate the premises immediately." Raymond blinked. His professional composure cracked for just a fraction of a second. His eyes moved to the swinging doors, then back to me, genuinely at a loss. "Sir E," he said carefully, "this is your building. Your company owns this entire hospitality group. You employ every person in this room. They cannot ask you to leave." And I gave him a small, measured smile. "They are not aware of that fact, Raymond, and I intend to honor the bride's demand to the letter. I am leaving right now, but as the sole owner of this operation, I am ordering an immediate and total cessation of all services for this event." Raymond did not waver. He asked no questions. He raised no objections about cost or consequence. He simply straightened his tie and gave a single composed nod. "Understood, Mr. Calloway. What are your specific instructions?" I looked around the kitchen at the hard-working people depending on this business to support their families. Every staff member receives full wages for the entire weekend, I told him. No one loses so much as $1 over my family's dispute, but I want this venue shut down right now. Stop the music, pull the food, close the bars. We are walking out. Raymond nodded. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his two-way radio, and pressed the transmit button. "All staff," he said, his voice clear and firm. "This is Raymond Code Black on the wedding reception. Cease all operations immediately. Set down your trays. Step away from your stations. We are evacuating the floor." I pushed back through the kitchen doors and entered the ballroom one final time. I positioned myself near the edge of the dance floor and waited. The band was deep into an upbeat, lively number. Guests spun and laughed under the crystal chandeliers. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. It wasn't a loud sound, but Raymond, who had followed me out, caught the signal. He turned and gave a sharp nod to the bandleader. The music cut out. Not a graceful fade, an abrupt total silence. The drummers stopped mid-beat. The brass players lowered their instruments. The lead singer pulled the microphone from his lips and killed the amplifier. The sudden total silence that crashed down over the ballroom was profoundly jarring. Hundreds of guests froze on the dance floor, looking around in complete bewilderment. A few laughed nervously, assuming it was some planned surprise or the lead-in to a speech, but the silence held deepening into something heavy and uncomfortable. Then the exodus began. On the far side of the room, a waiter carrying an enormous silver tray loaded with premium cuts of beef simply stopped moving. He set the tray down on the nearest guest table, right in the center of an elaborate floral arrangement, and walked away. Across the hall, another server carrying a dozen crystal champagne flutes placed his tray on a cocktail table and turned his back on the room. One by one, the entire serving staff abandoned their positions. The synchronized sound of silver trays and china plates being set down across the room rippled through the quiet like a wave. At the main bar, things were even more striking. Derek had been standing there waiting for a refill of his scotch. The bartender, a seasoned employee named Calvin, glanced at his radio, then looked at Derek. Without a word, Calvin took the bottle of premium whiskey from the counter, twisted the cap back into place, and lowered it into a transport case below the bar. He then began securing the liquor cabinet, snapping the heavy brass padlocks shut with loud, deliberate clicks. Hey, what are you doing?" Derek demanded, his voice ringing out awkwardly in the silent room. "I asked for a drink. Open that back up." Calvin did not spare him a glance. He wiped down the marble counter, folded his bar towel, and stepped out from behind the bar, joining the growing column of staff assembling at the rear of the room. Derek stood there, color rising in his face, a mixture of embarrassment and fury spreading through him. He looked around, taking in the strange, methodical departure of the people he assumed he was paying to serve him. Natalie was still standing near table 16, right where I had left her. The arrogant smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. She watched as the waitresses she had verbally torn apart earlier quietly untied their aprons and draped them over the backs of empty chairs. She watched the band members fitting their instruments into heavy black cases. She looked at the guests now, murmuring anxiously to each other, demanding to know why their half-eaten meals were being deserted. "What is happening?" Natalie's voice came out shrill and panicked. She grabbed the arm of a passing waiter. "Where do you think you're going? Bring out the next course right now." The waiter gently but firmly freed his arm from her grip. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm. "This event has been officially terminated by the owner. We are vacating the premises." "Owner?" Natalie shrieked, her eyes darting wildly around the room. "Derek is the owner of this event. He paid for all of this. Derek, get over here and fix this right now." Derek jogged over to her, looking completely lost. He dragged out his phone and frantically tried reaching the wedding planner, but she was already crossing toward the exit clipboard, tucked firmly under her arm. I stood near the main entrance, quietly straightening the cuffs of my faded jacket. A deep, settled calm had come over me. Raymond appeared at my side, followed closely by the executive chef. Behind them, a silent company of 45 staff members had arranged themselves into a neat, orderly line. They stood with quiet dignity, people who had chosen not to serve a couple that treated working people as something beneath them. I looked at my employees and gave them a slow, grateful nod. They had stood by me, and I would stand by them. I turned and walked toward the grand double doors of the main lobby. I did not look back. I moved at the steady, unhurried pace of a man with nothing left to prove. Behind me, 45 sets of footsteps rang across the marble floor in a unified procession. Gerald, Natalie's voice tore through the quiet ballroom. All the arrogance had left it. What remained was something close to terror. She had finally seen me at the head of the column. She had finally understood that the man she had mocked and expelled the man in the shabby suit was the one leading every member of her staff out the door. Gerald, what did you do? Tell them to come back. Derek, do something. Make them come back. Derek broke into a few urgent steps toward me, his face pale and damp. Dad, he called out, his voice splitting. Dad, please stop. What is going on? Why are they listening to you? I kept walking. I pressed through the heavy glass lobby doors and stepped out into the cool, clean night air. The valet attendants were already returning keys to the bewildered guests beginning to drift out of the ballroom. I followed the curbed stone path to the far end of the lot, where my battered 12-year-old pickup sat in the shadows. I unlocked the door, settled into the driver's seat, and felt the worn fabric press against my back, familiar and honest. Inside the ballroom, Raymond was the last man standing. He positioned himself beside the main electrical panel at the back of the hall and looked out at Derek and Natalie stranded in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by abandoned food, confused guests, and spreading humiliation. Raymond gave a slow, quiet shake of his head, reached out and gripped the heavy metal lever of the master breaker. Natalie released one final piercing scream of pure panic just as Raymond pulled it down. The massive crystal chandeliers went dark in an instant. The accent lights, the bar lights, the stage lights, every one of them died in a fraction of a second. The entire grand ballroom of the Magnolia Ridge Country Club was swallowed by absolute darkness. The sound of hundreds of guests crying out in shock and indignation filled the night, followed by the heavy thud of the front doors locking from the outside. I turned the key in my old truck and listened to the engine grumble to life, then pulled slowly out of the country club and drove away, leaving my ungrateful son and his cruel bride sitting in the dark wreckage of everything their arrogance had built. The engine settled into its familiar, dependable hum beneath me. I sat in the far corner of the parking lot, sheltered by the shadows of the old oak trees lining the property. The night air filtered through the cracked window, cool and carrying a faint trace of pine. I rested my hands on the worn steering wheel, feeling the texture that comes only from years of hard, honest labor. I did not drive away just yet. I stayed because I wanted to see the true price of arrogance paid in full. Through the windshield, I watched the grand entrance of the country club. Those massive double doors were usually framed by smiling valets and warm golden light. Now, they were thrown wide open, and a chaotic stream of angry, disoriented people was pouring out into the night. The fallout was immediate and complete. Men in expensive tuxedos held their phones aloft, sweeping faint flashlight beams across the darkened stone pathways. Women in silk gowns pulled shawls tight against the chill, complaining loudly about the ruined evening. With no valet staff to retrieve their cars, a long, frustrated line had formed at the parking booth. People were shouting over one another, shouldering past strangers in the dark. Waiters had set full trays of appetizers down on the lawn and walked away, leaving them for the birds. Security was nowhere. I watched a man Natalie had been working all evening to impress throw his hands up in exasperation and disappear into the darkness. The polished high society event she had spent months constructing had dissolved into a miserable, disorganized retreat. No one was talking about how beautiful the bride looked. They were talking about cold, empty plates and the humiliation of standing in the dark. Then the quiet inside my truck was broken. My phone resting on the passenger seat lit up the dark cabin like a beacon. Derek's name filled the screen. The phone shook violently against the cracked vinyl upholstery, each buzz a precise echo of the panic I knew he was drowning in. I did not answer. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, the screen lit up again, then again. A relentless, frantic volley of incoming calls. Derek was unraveling, watching his entire invented identity as a wealthy man collapse in front of the exact audience he had been performing for. The facade had cracked and fallen away, leaving nothing but a frightened, heavily indebted man standing in a dark room. The screen showed a dozen missed calls in the space of 3 minutes. Then the text messages began arriving one after another in rapid bursts, flashing briefly across the lock screen. Dad, where are you? Turn the lights back on this instant. You are embarrassing us. Please answer the phone. I read everyone with a slow, steady calm. It was striking how fast his tone collapsed from high-handed dismissal into desperate pleading. The man who had stood silent while his wife aimed her cruelty at me was now demanding that I pull him free from the wreckage of his own spinelessness. I leaned back into the headrest and exhaled a long, deliberate breath. Not one drop of pity stirred in me. Pity belongs to people who make honest mistakes, not to those who calculate your value by how much they can drain out of you. The phone went quiet for a beat, and a small icon blinked on the screen announcing a new voicemail. I reached over, lifted the phone, and hit the speaker button. I wanted his voice in my ears unfiltered. I wanted to gauge the precise depth of his desperation. The message opened with a heavy, ragged intake of breath. The noise behind him was total chaos, overlapping voices, angry guests demanding refunds, threatening to post damning reviews on every platform they could reach. "Dad, what in the hell did you just do?" Derek's voice rang through the small cab of my truck. He was barely holding it together, his words spilling out in a breathless, panicked rush. The whole staff walked out. They killed the power. The catering manager left us with nothing on the table. Half the guests are already pulling out of the lot. Natalie is locked inside the bridal suite, having a complete meltdown because her parents' friends are demanding answers. "You need to get back here and fix this right now. Tell whoever you paid to flip those lights back on." There was a short pause as someone in the background shouted at Derek. When he spoke again, the panic had hardened into a clumsy attempt at menace. "Listen to me, very carefully, old man," he snarled into the phone. "You think this is some kind of funny lesson, but you just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. I know you paid for the venue, but you do not get to just shut it down because your feelings got hurt. We had a verbal agreement. I am holding you personally responsible for this disaster. I am going to sue you for breach of contract. I am going to drag you into court and make you pay for every single penny of the damages the venue is going to charge us for this walkout. You are going to pay for ruining my wedding." The voicemail clicked off, leaving a hollow beep in its wake. I sat there in the dark and let out a deep, genuine laugh, a rich, booming sound that had not come out of me in years. Derek wanted to sue me for breach of contract. He wanted to hold me legally accountable for the walkout. He was so blinded by his own entitlement that he couldn't grasp the full shape of what he was dealing with. He believed Magnolia Ridge Country Club was some vast, untouchable corporation that would surely come after whoever torpedoed their event. He had no idea that I was the corporation. He was planning to sue the very man who held the contract he kept citing. He was threatening to haul me before a judge over a venue penalty that I alone had the authority to issue. He thought he was cornering me using the threat of financial ruin to force my hand. What my foolish son didn't know was that my legal team had already been instructed to draft the damage invoice. I wasn't going to be the one writing a check. I was going to be the one cashing one. I reached over and clicked the radio, on letting the low hum of a classic country station wash over the distant shouting still drifting from the club entrance. I put the truck in drive, the old transmission clunking faithfully into gear. As I rolled out of the parking lot and left the darkened venue behind me, I checked the rearview mirror one final time. The string of departing headlights looked like a funeral procession for my son's counterfeit life. The real fight was only just getting started, and Derek had already put the weapon in my hands. I drove out into the night, ready for whatever the morning would bring. The early sun threw a pale wash of light across the worn Formica countertops of my kitchen. I sat at the small wooden table, hands wrapped around a heavy stoneware mug of strong black coffee. The house was utterly silent, a deep, familiar quiet I had learned to live with since Evelyn passed. Our home was modest, built up over decades of honest work and careful spending. The walls were a plain off-white, the appliances older, but kept in perfect order. I never believed in replacing things that still had life in them. Derek always despised this house. He used to call it a depressing monument to mediocrity. To me, it was a fortress of integrity. I took a slow sip, letting the heat spread down my throat. I felt surprisingly well rested after the night's spectacle. I had driven home, stood under a hot shower, and slept 8 solid hours without interruption. A clear conscience is the finest sleep aid a man will ever find. That peaceful morning was shattered by a hard, rapid hammering on my front door. The solid wooden frame shook under the force of it. The doorbell fired off in quick, frantic bursts, bouncing off the walls of the quiet hallway. I didn't hurry. I set my mug down gently on the table, rose and smoothed the front of my faded chambray work shirt. I walked the short corridor at the unhurried pace of a man who already knows what's waiting on the other side. I turned the deadbolt and swung the door open. Derek and Natalie stood on my small concrete porch looking utterly wrecked. Every trace of the polished, gleaming image they had projected at that wedding was gone. Derek had on the same wrinkled dress shirt from the night before, collar splayed open dark with sweat stains. His eyes were bloodshot and restless, bouncing around like he couldn't fix them on anything. Natalie looked worse. Her elaborate bridal updo had come undone into a knotted tangle of blonde extensions and scattered hairpins. Her heavy makeup had slid down beneath her eyes, leaving dark smudge rings against pale skin. She was shaking in the morning chill, an oversized jacket thrown haphazardly over a pair of sweatpants. They looked like two people dragged ashore from a shipwreck, furiously scanning the beach for someone to pin it on. "What were you thinking?" Derek screamed the instant the door opened. "No good morning, no asking how I was doing." He lunged forward, his face flooding a deep crimson, his voice fracturing under the weight of exhaustion and raw rage. "You completely destroyed my life, Gerald. You ruined the most important night of my entire existence. Do you have any idea what you have done?" I stood squarely in the doorway, holding my ground. I looked at my son and felt a brief flickering sadness for the sorry shape he was in before the cold truth of everything he'd done sealed it off. "I know exactly what I did, Derek," I said, my voice quiet and stripped of all feeling. "I left a party where I wasn't welcome." Natalie pushed around Derek and thrust a trembling manicured finger inches from my face. "You are a spiteful, vindictive old monster," she rasped, her voice worn raw from a night of screaming. "You think you proved something by throwing a tantrum and walking out on us. You made us the laughingstock of the entire city." My parents had to personally apologize to the mayor. The man was left standing in a pitch-black banquet hall. "My friends are treating me like some charity case. You humiliated us in front of everyone who matters." "You humiliated yourselves, Natalie," I said quietly. "I simply turned off the lights so everyone could see you clearly." Derek slammed his palm against the wooden doorframe. "Cut the philosophical garbage, Dad," he snapped. "This isn't about your wounded feelings anymore. This is about cold, hard cash. After you pulled your pathetic little stunt and shut the venue down, the general manager locked us out and handed us a preliminary invoice on the spot. Do you understand me? He slapped us with a $50,000 penalty for the mass walkout, the breached timeline, and the ruined catering. $50,000, sir, Dad." He dragged both hands through his disheveled hair, pacing the length of my small porch like something caught in a trap. We spent the whole night on the phone with lawyers. Derek went on, his voice climbing toward the edge. "We reached Natalie's uncle. He works in corporate litigation. He said we have a rock-solid case against you. You verbally agreed to fund this wedding. You deliberately sabotaged at a contracted event. You are fully liable for the financial fallout. We are not leaving this porch until you write us a check for $50,000 to cover the penalty you caused." Natalie crossed her arms, nodding sharply. "You are going to pay for every single penny, Gerald," she demanded, her tone soaked in arrogant entitlement. "And you are going to pay for a public relations firm to repair the damage you did to my reputation. If you refuse, we will drag you into court and expose you as a senile, abusive old man. We will drain every last dime of your pathetic little savings account. You are going to regret the day you ever crossed me." I stood there and let their threats wash over me like rain off a stone. They were utterly predictable. Intimidation and legal bluster were their shield's cover for a complete absence of accountability. They were convinced they could browbeat an old man into opening his checkbook to clean up their own mess. They thought the high ground was theirs because they'd had a phone call with a lawyer. I turned around slowly, leaving the front door standing open. Derek and Natalie traded a look of smug satisfaction, certain they had broken something in me. They assumed I was heading back inside to find my checkbook. Instead, I crossed to the small entryway table where I keep my mail and important papers. I picked up a thick manila folder that my attorney Curtis Halford had couriered to my home late the previous night. I carried it back to the front door and stepped out onto the porch, the folder held steady in my right hand. "I am not writing you a check, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, measured edge. Derek moved toward me, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Then we will see you in court." "Dad," he shot back, "you are going to lose everything." I opened the manila folder and drew out a thick packet of crisp, legally binding documents. I extended the packet toward him. Derek snatched the papers from my grip, his eyes burning with fury. "What is this?" he snapped, glaring at the front page. "That is the master service agreement and venue contract for Magnolia Ridge Country Club," I said, holding his gaze. Turn to the last page, Derek. Look at the signature line. Derek tore through the heavy pages, his breathing short and rapid. Natalie leaned over his shoulder, her eyes moving across the dense legal text. They reached the final page. There at the bottom of the document was the signature block for the corporate entity that owned the country club, the catering group, and the entire hospitality staff. Printed clearly beneath the signature line was the title of the chief executive officer, Gerald Calloway. Derek's face drained of color in an instant. The angry red flush vanished from his cheeks, replaced by a sickly, washed-out gray. His hands began to shake violently, the thick paper rattling in the still morning air. He stared at my printed name, and my signature, reading it again and again, as though his mind flatly refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. "I do not understand," Natalie whispered, her voice stripped entirely of its usual arrogant edge. Her eyes moved from the contract to my face and back. "Gerald Calloway. That is you. How is your name on the ownership contract for the country club?" "Because I own it, Natalie," I said, my tone flat and absolute. "I own the venue. I own the catering company. I own the employment contracts of the 45 staff members you insulted. My private holding company has held that property for over a decade. I did not just pay the $80,000 invoice for your wedding. I own the corporation that issued the invoice." Derek looked up at me, his mouth working open and closed without producing a sound. He had the look of a man who had stepped off the edge of a cliff and was only now beginning to feel the fall. "Dad," he finally choked out, his voice barely a frightened rasp. "You own Magnolia Ridge Country Club." "I do, Derek," I confirmed, crossing my arms over my chest. "Which brings us to your demand for $50,000. You are absolutely correct about the penalty. The general manager was acting on my direct instructions when he handed you that invoice last night. However, you seem fundamentally confused about how this transaction is going to work. I am not paying the $50,000 penalty for the ruined event. I am the one charging you the $50,000 penalty." Natalie stumbled back, as though she'd taken a physical blow. Both hands flew to cover her mouth, a muffled gasp escaping between her fingers. "You breached the code of conduct outlined in the venue agreement when you verbally abused my staff." I continued, stepping forward and pressing Derek back down the porch stairs. "You caused significant financial damage through wasted inventory and operational disruption. The invoice you are holding is not a threat, Derek. It is a legal debt owed to my corporation. And since you boasted so loudly to all your wealthy guests about funding this wedding yourself with your enormous cryptocurrency windfall, I expect payment rendered in full within 30 days. Derek's legs seemed to buckle under him. He grabbed the wooden porch railing to keep himself upright, the heavy contract slipping from his trembling fingers and scattering across the concrete steps. "Dad, please," he begged, every trace of arrogance scrubbed from his face. "We do not have $50,000. We are completely broke. We put the entire honeymoon on credit cards. If you collect this debt, you will bankrupt us." I looked at the son who had been content to let me rot in a cheap house. I looked at the woman who had wanted me hidden in the back row of her wedding. I felt absolutely nothing. "Then I suggest you call Natalie's uncle and retain that corporate lawyer," I said quietly. "Because the debt is real and my collection agency is ruthless." I stepped back inside my modest home and pushed the heavy wooden door shut behind me. I turned the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click, locking them out in the cold morning air. I walked back to my kitchen, lifted my mug of black coffee, and took a long, satisfying sip. The coffee tasted exceptional. I stood at the kitchen window, mug in hand, looking out through the sheer curtains. The solid door between us was locked, but the scene unfolding on my front lawn needed no sound for me to grasp the full scale of their collapse. Derek was pacing in tight, frantic circles, kicking at the loose gravel along the edge of my driveway. Natalie stood frozen on the concrete steps. She slowly sank to her knees, the fabric of her sweatpants pressing against the cold stone, and began gathering the scattered pages of the venue contract Derek had dropped. Her hands were trembling so badly that the heavy parchment fluttered like dry leaves in a breeze. I watched her collect the pages and turn to the final sheet. Even through the glass, I could see the precise moment her reality came apart. She stared at the signature block, her eyes tracing my name over and over. She looked up at my modest single-story house, then over at my battered 12-year-old pickup sitting in the driveway. The cognitive dissonance was tearing through her. The man she had ordered to the back row, The man she had mocked as looking like a janitor was the undisputed sovereign of the elite world she had spent her whole life clawing toward. Natalie rose to her feet, clutching the contract against her chest, her face drained of every drop of color. The arrogant sneer she wore like a crown was gone, replaced by a mask of hollow terror. She walked down the steps toward Derek, holding the paper out as if it were something dangerous. Derek stopped pacing and turned. I could make out the muffled sound of their voices through the thick window glass. Natalie was speaking in rapid, frantic bursts, jabbing her finger at the signature and then pointing back at my house. Then Derek erupted. He tore the contract from her hands and flung it onto the wet grass. He seized the sides of his head and screamed something up at the morning sky. The illusion he had so carefully built for his new bride was finished. He had spent 2 years persuading Natalie that he was a self-made cryptocurrency genius who bankrolled their lavish life. Now she knew the truth. She knew she had married a broke, desperate fraud who was entirely dependent on the very father he had allowed her to humiliate. I decided I wasn't quite done. The invoice Raymond had handed them the night before was only the preliminary penalty for the walkout. It didn't begin to cover the physical destruction they had left behind. I set my coffee mug on the counter, unlocked the front door, and pushed it open one final time. The sudden sound made them both flinch. Derek spun around his face, contorted with a venomous, panicked rage. "Are you happy now, Dad?" he screamed, marching to the edge of my lawn, but stopping just short of the porch steps. "You proved your point. You showed everyone you were the big boss. You ruined my marriage before it even started. Natalie is packing her bags. Are you proud of yourself?" I stepped out onto the porch and drew a small folded piece of paper from my shirt pocket. "Your marriage is none of my concern, Derek," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his shouting. "Property damage is." After the last of your guests were cleared out, the general manager walked every inch of that ballroom and put together a full accounting. "I thought you ought to see the itemized breakdown before my collection agency comes knocking." Natalie edged forward, her eyes stretched wide with fear. "Property damage." She managed her voice so unsteady the words barely held together. "Nothing got broken, Gerald. We were standing around in the dark." "You weren't the problem," I told her, holding her gaze steadily. "Your famished, furious guests were a different matter entirely. Once that room went dark and the crowd started panicking, tables went down, 12 crystal centerpieces imported from Italy smashed to pieces, 4 antique mahogany dining chairs badly damaged, and the premium catering order was a total write-off. 300 portions of dry-aged Wagyu beef spoiling on the prep tables because you ran my executive chef out of his own kitchen." Derek dug his fingers into his hair and wrenched at it. "You can't charge us for food your own people walked away from," he snarled, spraying spit as he shouted. "You told the staff to leave." "I directed them to exit a hostile work environment," I said, without a trace of sympathy in my voice. "One that existed because your wife physically assaulted a waitress. Under the master service agreement, you put your name to the client carries full financial responsibility for all perishable inventory whenever an event ends due to client misconduct. The $50,000 figure was strictly the breach of contract fine. Factor in the wasted food, the broken crystal, and the hazard pay owed to my cleaning crew, and your personal balance comes to $82,000. Natalie made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. $82,000. She turned on Derek, her face contorted with contempt. "You told me you were wealthy, Derek. You said there were millions sitting in offshore accounts. Tell him to pull it from your investments. Tell him to take it straight out of your portfolio." Derek couldn't meet her eyes. He fixed his stare on the ground, his breathing ragged and labored. "There is no portfolio," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "There are no offshore accounts, Natalie. There is nothing. He bankrolled the entire wedding. He has paid for everything." Natalie looked at him the way you look at someone you've never actually met before. Everything she'd built her life around: status, money, the appearance of power, and she had chained herself to a man who possessed none of it. "You deceived me?" She breathed, her voice thin with revulsion. "You are absolutely nothing. A broke, pathetic fraud propped up by his father's wallet." Something in Derek gave way. The humiliation and the financial freefall curdled into something ugly and uncontrolled. He wheeled away from Natalie and let out a raw, guttural cry. Then he stormed toward the driveway and drove his foot hard into the front bumper of my battered 12-year-old pickup. The truck absorbed it without a flinch. Derek did not. He howled and reeled backward, grabbing his foot. He lifted his head and fixed me with a look of scorching hatred, tears cutting down his face. "I will destroy you," he screamed, balancing on one foot. "It doesn't matter what you're worth. You don't get to do this to family. I will make you pay for every bit of this. I will bring your whole life down around you." I observed his tantrum with the detachment of a man watching weather pass through. "A man without matches can't set a fire, Derek," I said quietly. "You have 30 days to send payment to the holding company. If that deadline passes, my attorneys will place liens against every asset you hold. Now, clear off my property, or I will ring the police and report you for trespassing and vandalism." He glowered at me, chest still heaving, but the fight had gone out of him. He limped silently toward the passenger door of Natalie's car. She didn't give him the chance to open it. The instant his fingers grazed the handle, she triggered the automatic locks. The click rang sharp and final in the still neighborhood air. Derek pressed his face to the glass, his expression pleading, but Natalie reversed hard out of the driveway and was gone, leaving her husband of less than 24 hours standing alone in the street. I watched him fumble his phone out of his pocket and start hunting for a rideshare. Then I went inside and locked the door behind me. I crossed to the entryway table to go through what remained of the morning mail. A thick envelope from my personal bank sat in the pile. I pulled it open expecting nothing of consequence. What slid out stopped me cold, a notice concerning a second mortgage levied against my late wife's property. I looked at the signature line. My name was there. The hand that wrote it was not mine. This had moved beyond a family argument into the territory of serious federal crime. I pulled out my phone and rang Curtis Halford's direct line. We had work ahead of us. After the front door locked behind me, the house went quiet in a way that felt total and complete. I lingered in the hallway, catching the last faint sound of Derek's footsteps retreating down the drive. No car waiting, no wife to carry him off. Nothing but the fallout of choices he'd made entirely on his own. I breathed in slowly and let the familiar stillness of my home settle around me. For years, that stillness had been crowded out Derek's relentless needs, his hunger for my approval, always something demanded, and never enough given. I'd kept Natalie in my life, because I believed losing her meant losing him. That calculation no longer applied. I moved to the small oak table by the front door, set my coffee mug on its coaster, a soft, quiet tap against the wood, and worked through the stack of envelopes. Circulars, utility bills, the usual. But toward the bottom sat a thick, heavy packet from the bank I had used for personal finances my entire adult life, not my corporate account. The branch where Evelyn and I had walked in together over 40 years ago and opened our first joint account. The return address came stamped in red urgent correspondence from the lending and mortgage division. That made no sense to me. I hadn't borrowed against anything personally in 30 years. The house was mine, clear of any debt. The vehicles, too. Every corporate transaction flowed through a separate entity, with its own accounting staff. The mortgage department had no business writing to me, certainly not urgently, certainly not by certified mail. I worked open the envelope and drew out the document inside. The heading declared it a formal approval and disbursement notice for a secondary mortgage. I read that line twice. The bank was stating that a $200,000 line of credit had been authorized and the funds already wired to an outside escrow account. A slow, heavy drumming started up in my chest. I found the property listed as collateral. It wasn't this house. It was a tract of land and an old farmhouse sitting in the next county, Evelyn's estate. Evelyn had come into that land through her grandparents. In the first 5 years of our marriage, we had rebuilt that farmhouse board by board with our own hands. On weekends when the city ground us down, that was where we went. Before she died, Evelyn asked me to swear I would keep it in the family. No corporate transaction had ever touched it. Of everything I owned, that land was the piece that money couldn't assign a number to. And here was a document telling me someone had borrowed $200,000 against it. I turned to the second page, a photocopy of the executed loan agreement. I went straight to the bottom right corner and the signature block. Written there in dark blue ink was my name, Gerald Calloway. I studied it carefully. Whoever had done this was skilled. The lean of the capital G, the clean, deliberate stroke through the second L, close enough to make a bank officer comfortable, but the hand wasn't mine. The loops moved too fast without the settled, consistent pressure behind them that I put into my signature, and the date beside that forged name was exactly 14 days ago. I shut my eyes and reached back through my memory to 2 weeks prior. Before we go any further, I want you to understand what's really at stake in the next few minutes. Not just money, not just pride, but the kind of betrayal that cuts deepest when it comes from inside your own home. If you ever discovered that someone you loved and trusted had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and gather every last piece of proof first? It had been a Tuesday evening. Derek had shown up at the house without calling ahead. His printer was broken. He said urgent documents needed for a presentation at his firm. I'd let him in, without hesitation offered him a plate of food and pointed him toward the computer in my home office. I headed into the kitchen to put on a fresh pot of coffee. I was away perhaps 20 minutes. When I came back carrying 2 steaming mugs, Derek looked up with a sharp, guilty jolt. He shoved a file drawer shut, the exact drawer where I store the original deeds and tax documents for every personal property I own. He laughed it off, said he'd dropped a pen, but his forehead was slick with sweat. He snapped his briefcase shut fast, after that made his excuses, and walked out without touching his coffee. The pieces locked together with a nauseating thud. Derek hadn't come over to print anything. He'd come to steal the deed information for Evelyn's estate. He'd lifted the property details, counterfeited my signature on a loan application, and used the one thing I held sacred as collateral to secure a massive line of credit. I looked back at the document in my hands. The escrow account where the $200,000 had landed was held under a title company, one that handled luxury real estate deals across the city. He had robbed his own father to cover the down payment on the high-rise condo where he and Natalie lived. Natalie had wanted a showpiece home that matched her idea of an elite life. Derek, clinging desperately to the illusion of being a wealthy cryptocurrency investor, had stolen from his own family to purchase her approval. He had mortgaged the land his mother had loved simply to dazzle a woman who saw him as nothing more than a rung on a ladder. He had put at risk the ground where Evelyn and I had built our life together, all to prop up a fraud that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. I set the documents down quietly on the oak table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't hurl the coffee mug at the wall. The rage I'd carried the night before at the country club had been hot, a burning, combustible thing. What rose in me now was something else entirely. This was cold, a deep sub-zero fury that moved through my bones like frost through stone. Walking out on a wedding reception was a family quarrel. Refusing to absorb an $80,000 penalty was a lesson in accountability, but putting a forged name on a mortgage document was not a display of temper. It was not a gray area. It was a felony. Derek had committed identity theft. He had committed wire fraud. He had defrauded a federally insured financial institution. He had stepped across a line that no apology and no tearful confession could pull him back from. He had set in motion events that carry mandatory minimum prison sentences. My son had looked me in the face, eaten at my table, and walked out with $200,000 that was never his to take. I moved to the living room window and stood looking out at the quiet street. Sunlight lay across it cleanly, but the world had a different shape than it had 10 minutes earlier. Derek had made a fundamental error in his reading of me. He believed I was a soft-hearted old man who would quietly absorb his crimes to protect the family name. He assumed that even if I uncovered the forged loan, I would simply pay it down to bury the scandal. He thought my feeling for him would override my respect for the law and my reverence for what Evelyn had left behind. He had miscalculated on every count. I built a business empire in an arena crowded with predators and opportunists. I survived because I never let sentiment interfere with my response when someone crossed a line. Derek was no longer simply a son who had shown me disrespect. He was an adversary who had moved against my assets and violated the trust of my home. I took my phone from my pocket, pulled up my contacts, and found the private number for Curtis Halford. Curtis was the senior partner at the most relentless corporate litigation firm in the state, my personal attorney, my corporate counsel, and the man I called when someone tried to take something from me. I hit call and brought the phone to my ear. It rang twice before his deep, measured voice came on the line. "Good morning, Gerald," Curtis said, crisp and professional. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. I figured you'd still be winding down from the wedding." "There's nothing to wind down from, Curtis," I answered, keeping my voice flat and even. "Clear your morning. Everything else can wait. We have a serious situation to address." "What kind of situation?" The easy tone dropped out of his voice in an instant, replaced by the sharpened focus of a man who senses something real. "I'm standing over a formal notice from Heritage Federal Bank," I said, walking back to the table and fixing my eyes on that forged signature. Derek took out a $200,000 secondary mortgage against Evelyn's estate. He forged my signature on the application and had the funds routed to a title company to buy the condo he lives in. A heavy silence held the line. When Curtis spoke again, every trace of warmth was gone from his voice. Gerald, that is identity theft and major bank fraud. Federal charges, serious prison exposure. If we bring this forward, law enforcement will be in the middle of it. I need you to be completely certain this is the direction you want to go with your own son. I looked at the forged signature one final time. I thought about Derek on my porch threatening to paint me as a senile, abusive old man. I thought about Natalie screaming at that waitress. I thought about the bottomless, corrosive greed that had swallowed the boy I spent a lifetime raising. I am completely certain, Curtis, I said, my voice carrying through the empty house. I'm on my way to your office now. I want a full forensic audit of Derek's financial life, every credit card, every account, every loan he's ever had his name on. He chose to wade into deep water. It's time we let the current take him. I didn't bother changing clothes. No suit, no effort to dress the part for the sleek glass towers of the financial district. I folded the forged mortgage documents, tucked them into the inner pocket of my jacket, and walked out to my truck. The drive downtown passed in a wash of gray concrete and slow morning traffic. My mind was clear, cold, and fixed. For 34 years, my central purpose had been shielding my son from the hard edges of the world. Now, my central purpose was shielding Evelyn's legacy from my son. I pulled into the underground parking structure beneath Peachtree Plaza Tower. The valet attendant, a young man accustomed to handling imported luxury sedans, took my keys with a respectful nod. He knew exactly who I was. The elevator climbed in silence to the 42nd floor. When the steel doors parted, I walked out into the wide, spare reception area of Halford and Associates. Dark walnut paneling lined the walls alongside abstract artwork that likely cost more than most people's houses. The receptionist looked up and recognized me before I reached the desk. She didn't ask whether I had an appointment. She rose, offered a quiet, composed smile, and directed me down the main corridor. "Mr. Halford is waiting for you, Mr. Calloway." I moved past the seating area and pushed through the heavy double doors at the hall's end. Curtis Halford's office opened before me. Curtis stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, his gaze on the city spread out below. He was 55, silver hair drawn back with precision, a tailored navy suit fitting him the way armor is supposed to fit. He turned the moment I entered. Nothing moved across his face, but his eyes were doing rapid, precise work reading my posture, my expression, the set of my jaw. He crossed to his broad mahogany desk and motioned toward one of the leather guest chairs. "You don't make the trip downtown on a weekday morning, unless something has collapsed or someone has declared outright war, Gerald." He said, his voice a low, unhurried baritone. "Which is it?" I didn't take the chair. I walked straight to the desk, reached into my jacket, and laid the folded bank documents on the polished surface. They slid across the wood and came to rest directly in front of him. "Both, Curtis," I said. He picked up the documents and started reading. He did not rush. He worked through every line on the first page, then turned to the signature block on the second. He held his gaze on that forged signature for a long moment. Then he set the papers back on the desk and folded his hands together. "I assume," he began, his voice entirely neutral, "that you did not authorize a $200,000 secondary mortgage against Evelyn's estate." "I did not," I confirmed. "Derek forged my signature. He used those funds as a down payment on the luxury condo where he and his new wife now live. He got into my private filing cabinet 2 weeks ago while I was in the kitchen making him coffee." Curtis leaned back in his chair. A slow smile spread across his face. Not amusement, but the particular look of a predator handed the key to a locked door. He pressed one finger to his lips, turning the angles over in his mind. "Wire fraud," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Identity theft, defrauding a federally insured institution, forgery of legal instruments." He raised his eyes back to mine, something sharp and dangerous glinting in them. "Your son has been remarkably busy, Gerald." "What is our immediate legal exposure?" I asked, keeping us on operational ground. "None," Curtis answered without hesitation. "We file a formal affidavit of forgery with the bank by noon tomorrow. That freezes the account and triggers their internal fraud review. We file a concurrent police report to establish the identity theft on record. The bank will pull the line of credit and go after the title company to recover the disbursed funds. If those funds haven't reached the seller, yet the condo purchase collapses entirely. If the sale has already closed, the bank places an immediate lien on the property and begins foreclosure proceedings against Derek. He picked up a silver pen and turned it between his fingers. The civil liability is entirely his. The criminal liability is entirely his. He built himself a perfect self-executing trap. I crossed to the window and looked down at the street far below, the cars moving like dots through the gray morning. I need to understand the full scale of what he has done, Curtis. A man who would forge a document against his own mother's estate is hiding other things. I want to know the complete picture before I move on him directly. Curtis nodded and pressed his intercom button. Rebecca? He said, speaking to his senior paralegal, I need a comprehensive forensic audit started immediately. The subject is Derek Calloway. Personal accounts, credit card histories, any investment holdings, outstanding loans, all of it. I want to know where he banks, where he shops, and who holds the title to his car. Pull everything. We are going scorched earth. He released the button and looked back at me. We'll have the preliminary numbers by tomorrow evening, Gerald. But brace yourself. A man who steals from his father to finance a luxury condo is not someone who has his finances under control. This audit is going to uncover serious deficits. We're likely looking at substantial debts, possibly to private lenders. I'm prepared for it, I said, my voice steady. Find the floor, Curtis. I want to see exactly how far down the rot goes. And I want everything in writing, every transaction, every lie, every dollar he took that wasn't his. When I face him, I want evidence he can't explain away. Consider it done, Curtis said, sliding the forged documents into a secure red folder. He rose from his desk, came around it, and offered his hand. I'm sorry things have reached this point, Gerald. I know how much that boy has meant to you. I took his hand, my grip firm. I did love him, Curtis, but the man who put his name on that mortgage document is someone I don't know, and I don't allow strangers to steal from my family. I turned and walked out through the heavy doors and back into the corridor. The shock of the betrayal had burned off entirely, leaving something cooler and more precise, a methodical, unwavering resolve. Derek believed he had outmaneuvered a sentimental old man. He was about to discover the difference between performing power and actually possessing it. I took the elevator down to the parking garage, climbed back into my battered 12-year-old pickup, and headed out into the city to begin dismantling my son's fabricated life one layer at a time. I was in the kitchen pouring my second cup of coffee when the doorbell sounded. 3 sharp, impatient rings fired off in quick succession. I didn't hurry. I walked the hallway at the same measured pace I'd kept all week. The past 2 days had been spent coordinating with Curtis, assembling every financial record, medical document, and security footage file we required. I had expected an escalation. I simply hadn't expected it to arrive at my front door quite this quickly. I pulled the door open. Derek was on my porch in a sharp, well-tailored suit, looking nothing like the frantic, defeated man who had kicked my truck only days before. Hair perfectly set, posture rigid and performed, projecting an authority he didn't possess. Beside him stood a woman I hadn't encountered before, wearing a sensible gray blazer, a thick leather clipboard in her hands. Her expression was professionally neutral, though her eyes moved over me with quiet assessment, noting my worn jeans and faded chambray work shirt. Dad, Derek said, his voice honeyed with exaggerated concern. I brought someone I'd like you to meet. This is Ms. Darrow from Adult Protective Services. We just want to talk. I looked at Ms. Darrow, then back at Derek. I didn't move aside. I held my position in the doorway, one hand resting easy on the brass handle. To what do I owe this visit, Ms. Darrow? I said, keeping my tone civil but giving nothing away. Ms. Darrow stepped forward and opened her clipboard. Mr. Calloway, a report has been filed expressing concern about your recent conduct. She said, her manner measured and careful. Your son has documented what he describes as erratic behavior, sudden financial hostility, and aggressive outbursts, specifically in connection with a recent family event. We're here to conduct a preliminary welfare check. Derek sighed heavily and shook his head, performing the role of a burdened and devoted son. Dad, please. He said, the words landing like rehearsed lines. You haven't been acting like yourself. Shutting down the wedding venue, making impossible financial demands, locking me out. You're confused. I'm only here because I want to help you before things get worse. I let his words sit in the morning air and said nothing for a moment. The audacity of the strategy was, I had to admit, almost something to marvel at. He wasn't merely trying to sidestep the consequences of the forgery. He was attempting a full hostile takeover of my life. If he could persuade Adult Protective Services that I was in serious cognitive decline, he could go before a judge and seek medical power of attorney. With that authority, he could seize access to my accounts, strip my assets, and quietly erase the evidence of his own crimes. He was trying to bury me in order to save himself. Ms. Darrow, I said, turning my attention fully away from my son, I understand you have professional duties to fulfill, but I think it is important that you know the man standing beside you is currently the subject of an active federal investigation, identity theft, wire fraud, and the forgery of a $200,000 mortgage document. Derek's face flickered. That mask of devoted concern slipped for just a fraction of a second before he caught it. Ms. Darrow frowned her pen, pausing above her clipboard. Sir, she said carefully, those are extremely serious allegations. My focus today, however, is your cognitive well-being. Your son has raised concerns about paranoid delusions relating to your finances. They are not delusions, Ms. Darrow, I said, calm and even. They are documented facts. I stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing them toward the living room. Please come in, both of you. I think we can put this to rest very quickly. Derek hesitated, a brief anxious glance cast back toward the street. But Ms. Darrow walked past him into the house, and he had no real choice but to follow. I guided them into the living room, where I had deliberately left several manila folders arranged on the coffee table. I didn't offer either of them a seat. I walked over to the table and lifted the first folder. Derek moved to seize the narrative the moment we were all inside. You see, Ms. Darrow, he said, gesturing at the folders. He's consumed by paperwork. He believes everyone around him is stealing from him. Classic paranoid thinking. I handed the first folder directly to the social worker. Ms. Darrow, please review that opening document, I instructed. It is a full cognitive and neurological evaluation completed just 3 weeks ago by Dr. Leonard Ashworth, the head of neurology at Piedmont Medical Center. It was a mandatory requirement for renewing my corporate life insurance policy. You will note that I scored in the 99th percentile for memory retention, executive function, and logical reasoning. I am entirely competent. Ms. Darrow scanned the medical report, her eyes widening slightly as she reached the prominent doctor's signature. I picked up the second folder and placed it in her hands. That is a certified copy of a fraud affidavit filed yesterday with Heritage Federal Bank. It details a secondary mortgage taken out against my late wife's estate. I did not sign that document. My son did. He used those funds to purchase a luxury condominium. Derek's face drained of color. He stepped forward, his voice climbing in panic. That is a lie, he shouted, jabbing a finger in my direction. He is making this up to destroy me. Do you see how vindictive he is? This is exactly what I have been telling you. I reached into my pocket and produced a small digital tablet. I set it on the table and pressed play. Ms. Darrow, I said quietly. You mentioned erratic behavior at a family event. What you are about to see is security footage from Magnolia Ridge Country Club, recorded the night of my son's wedding reception. The cameras are equipped with high-definition audio. The screen lit up, revealing the grand ballroom. The footage captured the precise moment Natalie approached my table. The audio was crystal clear. Ms. Darrow watched in silence as Natalie shrieked at me, calling me a janitor and demanding I remove myself from the building. She watched Derek standing at the bar, actively ignoring every word of it. And she watched me calmly rise from my seat, button my jacket, and order the entire staff to clear the premises. I paused the video and met Ms. Darrow's gaze. Does that look like the behavior of a man suffering from dementia? I asked. Or does it look like a business owner invoking a breach of contract clause after being verbally assaulted by a hostile client? Ms. Darrow lowered her clipboard. She looked at the medical evaluation, then at the fraud affidavit, and finally at Derek. The professional neutrality she had worn when she arrived was replaced by a sharp, condemning stare. Mr. Calloway, she said, addressing Derek, her voice ice cold. Filing a false report with Adult Protective Services in an attempt to manipulate a financial investigation is a serious offense. Derek opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was completely trapped. The story he had so carefully built collapsed in under 5 minutes. He stared at the folders in her hands, then up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, cornered terror. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't do this." "You did this, Derek," I replied, my voice steady in the quiet living room. "You brought a government official into my home to try to strip away my independence. You thought you could use my age as a weapon against me. I turned back to Miss Darrow. Are we finished here? We are absolutely finished, sir, she replied, returning the folders to me. I apologize for the intrusion. I will be closing this case immediately. She turned to Derek. I would strongly suggest you retain a very good attorney, Mr. Calloway. She walked out the front door without a backward glance. Derek stood alone in the center of my living room, the silence pressing down on him like something solid. He had fired his best shot, and it had missed entirely. Get out of my house, Derek, I said, pointing toward the door, and do not ever come back. I had directed Ms. Darrow to take a seat on the floral-patterned sofa at the center of my living room. Derek had immediately claimed the armchair nearest to her, leaning forward with his hands clasped together in a practiced impression of a concerned son. He had rehearsed every beat of this performance. He looked at me with wide, sorrowful eyes, shaking his head in slow, theatrical dismay, as though watching a man he loved slip away. I did not sit down. I crossed the room to the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner. It was the same cabinet Derek had gone through 2 weeks earlier to forge the mortgage documents. I pulled open the top drawer and withdrew 3 thick manila folders, then carried them back to the center of the room. I laid them on the glass coffee table squarely in front of Ms. Darrow. Derek reached for the first folder, but I placed my hand firmly on top of it. These are for the state investigator Derek, I said, my voice perfectly level. You forfeited the right to review my personal documents the moment you forged my signature to purchase a luxury condominium. Ms. Darrow frowned slightly, her gaze moving between the two of us. She drew the first folder toward herself and opened it. Ms. Darrow, I said, standing tall with my hands clasped at my back. Your report claims I am suffering from severe cognitive decline and paranoia. Inside that folder, you will find a thorough neurological and psychiatric evaluation conducted exactly 18 days ago by Dr. Leonard Ashworth, Chief of Neurology at the State Medical Board. It was a mandatory requirement for renewing my corporate executive life insurance policy. Derek scoffed loudly, waving his hand in dismissal. Doctors can be fooled, Ms. Darrow. He cut in, his voice thick with manufactured exasperation. My father can hold himself together for an hour in a clinic, but you weren't there at the wedding. He was completely unhinged. Ms. Darrow did not look at Derek. She was reading the medical report, her eyes moving carefully through the detailed paragraphs. I watched her professional demeanor shift from skeptical to sharply attentive. She noted the cognitive test scores, the brain scan results, and the doctor's definitive conclusion that my mental faculties placed me in the top 1% for my age bracket. She closed the folder and looked up at me with a new measure of respect. I tapped the second folder on the table. The report also claims I am experiencing paranoid delusions about my finances and that I cut off my son without rational cause. Please open the second file. Ms. Darrow opened the folder. Inside was a certified copy of my most recent corporate tax return, alongside the operating agreement for my private holding company. Derek craned his neck to see the figures printed on the heavy parchment. The moment he caught a glimpse of the gross annual revenue, all the color left his face. He sank back into the armchair, as if the air had gone out of him. You will see, Ms. Darrow, I continued, my voice carrying through the stillness of the room, that I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of a hospitality and real estate empire generating tens of millions of dollars each year. I manage a board of directors. I oversee acquisitions. I do not harbor delusions about my finances. My finances are meticulously audited by a team of certified public accountants. I cut off my son's allowance because I discovered he was using my money to sustain a lavish, fabricated lifestyle while openly permitting his new wife to humiliate me in public. That is a lie, Derek shouted, lurching up from the armchair. He is twisting everything. Natalie was stressed about the wedding, and he blew it all out of proportion to punish us. He shut down the entire venue because he threw a senile temper tantrum. I lifted the third item from the table, not a folder, but a sleek digital tablet. I unlocked the screen and handed it directly to Ms. Darrow. Ms. Darrow, I said quietly, you have been asked to determine whether I suffered an erratic psychotic break at Magnolia Ridge Country Club. I own Magnolia Ridge Country Club. That tablet holds the high-definition security footage from the main ballroom and the catering kitchen. The audio is crystal clear. Please press play. Ms. Darrow tapped the screen. The quiet of the living room was broken by the sounds of the wedding reception. The video showed me sitting calmly at a table in the back corner. Then Natalie stormed into frame. Her Her shrill, vicious voice filled the room through the tablet's speakers. Miss Darrow watched as Natalie screamed at me, calling me a cheap, bitter old man and a janitor who had wandered in off the street. She watched Derek standing at the bar, a glass of scotch in hand, deliberately looking the other direction while his father was being publicly humiliated. Then the footage showed my response. Ms. Darrow watched me calmly wipe my mouth, rise from my seat button my jacket, and tell Natalie that respect is earned, not bought. She watched me walk into the kitchen without a single raised voice or unsteady gesture and instruct my general manager to legally terminate the event on grounds of client hostility. I paused the video. "Does that look like a man suffering from dementia, Ms. Darrow?" I asked. "Or does it look like a corporate executive enforcing a breach of contract after being verbally assaulted on his own property?" Ms. Darrow set the tablet down on the coffee table. She closed the folders one by one and arranged them into a neat, deliberate pile. The composed expression she had carried through the door was completely gone. She turned slowly to face Derek. The look she gave him was one of pure, unqualified disgust. Derek swallowed hard, retreating until the backs of his knees found the armchair. "Ms. Darrow, please." He stammered, a nervous sweat rising on his forehead. "You have to understand he is manipulating the context." "Mr. Calloway," Ms. Darrow said, her voice sharp and cutting right through him. "My agency exists to protect vulnerable elderly citizens from exploitation and abuse. We are severely underfunded, and we carry hundreds of critical cases involving people who genuinely need our intervention. You brought me into this home under false pretenses, attempting to weaponize my authority against a perfectly healthy man." She gathered her thick leather clipboard and rose to her feet, looming over him with unmistakable moral authority. "You tried to use Adult Protective Services to lay the groundwork for a fraudulent medical power of attorney. That is not merely a waste of state resources. It is a crime. I am closing this case at once. Beyond that, I am entering a formal notation in our system documenting your malicious intent. Should you ever contact our agency again, I will personally refer your conduct to the district attorney's office for filing a false government report." Derek opened his mouth to push back, but whatever lie he had ready dissolved under the sheer weight of her authority. He dropped his gaze to his expensive leather shoes, utterly defeated. Ms. Darrow turned to me and offered a brief, respectful nod. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Calloway," she said. "It is clear you have everything well in hand." "Thank you for your time, Ms. Darrow," I replied, walking her toward the front hallway. I opened the door and let the cool morning air move through the house. Ms. Darrow walked out, descended the steps, and climbed into her state-issued sedan, pulling away without a backward glance. I left the front door standing wide open and turned back to the living room. Derek was still planted near the coffee table, staring at the folders. He looked small, diminished, and completely out of moves. His last desperate ambush had fallen apart, and now he was alone in the room with the man he had tried to ruin. The rest of that day passed in a kind of suspended animation. I moved through the house, performing ordinary tasks with mechanical steadiness. I watered the plants on the back patio. I sorted through the tools in the garage. I even put together a simple dinner of pork chops and roasted potatoes, though I had little real appetite. I was waiting for the next blow to land. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It carried the heavy coiled tension that comes just before a serious storm breaks. Knowing about Derek's forgery had permanently altered the terrain of my life. He was no longer simply an ungrateful son. He was a criminal on the other side of a dispute. It was just after 8 in the evening when my mobile phone finally cut through the quiet. The screen showed Curtis Halford's private number. I set my dish towel on the kitchen counter and picked up the call. "Good evening, Curtis," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Tell me you have something solid." "Good evening, Gerald," Curtis replied, his tone stripped of any pleasantries. His voice was clipped precise and entirely focused. "The forensic accounting team has been running non-stop since you left the office. We have activated the fraud protocols with Heritage Federal Bank. They have officially frozen the escrow account tied to the forged mortgage. Derek cannot touch those funds. The condo purchase is dead in the water." "Excellent," I said, allowing myself a small measure of satisfaction. "That seals off his immediate escape route. What about the audit? Did you find the bottom of the barrel?" Curtis let out a low, humorless sound, less a chuckle than a growl. "Gerald," he said, "we did not just find the bottom of the barrel. We found an entirely new one buried underneath it. Your son's financial situation is not simply a shortfall, it is a catastrophic collapse. And that is not even the most alarming thing we turned up. I frowned, bracing myself against the kitchen counter. Explain. Let us start with Derek. Curtis began, the rustle of thick paper audible through the line. He is completely insolvent. Over the past 18 months, he has maxed out 7 different high-yield credit cards. He carries roughly $65,000 in unsecured consumer debt alone. His cryptocurrency investments, the ones he boasted so loudly about, are virtually non-existent. He bought high, sold low, and effectively gutted his own portfolio just to service the interest on his credit cards. He does not hold a single tangible asset. The luxury car he drives is leased, and he is 3 months behind on those payments. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers to the bridge of my nose. He had constructed an entire life out of smoke and mirrors. He had fought desperately to project the image of a successful elite entrepreneur while drowning under a mountain of debt. He forged a mortgage on his mother's estate because he had no other options left for keeping up the facade. It is pathetic, I murmured, but it is precisely what I expected. What is the alarming part, Curtis? The alarming part concerns his new bride, Curtis said, his voice dropping into a serious, measured register. When my team began following the money, we naturally looked at the $80,000 you transferred to Derek to cover the wedding expenses. Given his level of debt, we assumed he might have diverted some of it to pay off his cards. Did he? I asked. No, Curtis replied. Derek actually transferred the full $80,000 directly into a joint checking account he had opened with Natalie 3 months prior. He explicitly designated those funds for the wedding vendors. The problem, Gerald, is not what Derek did with the money. The problem is what Natalie did with it. I straightened up and gripped the phone tighter. What did she do? Natalie was the one managing vendor payments, Curtis explained. She was writing the checks to the country club, the florist, and the band. But my forensic team identified a serious discrepancy in the outgoing wire transfers. Over a span of 8 weeks, Natalie initiated 5 separate transfers out of that joint account. Each one was labeled as a miscellaneous vendor fee or administrative deposit. But none of them went to any wedding vendor, Gerald. Where did they go? I demanded, my pulse rising. They went to a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Curtis said, the revelation landing like something physical. An account registered under the name Natalie Drummond, her maiden name. She methodically siphoned $25,000 of your money right out from under Derek's nose. The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly. I stood staring at the dark window, working to absorb the sheer scale of the deception. Natalie had not simply married Derek for his supposed wealth. She had not merely tolerated his arrogant pretensions because she believed he was a self-made man. She had been actively stealing from him before they ever exchanged vows. She had recognized immediately that he was a desperate, easily manipulated fool, and she had set about building her own secret safety net before the ink on the marriage license was dry. She was embezzling from the wedding fund, I said quietly, the full shape of it snapping into place. Exactly, Curtis confirmed. She skimmed nearly a third of the entire budget you provided. She knew Derek was desperate to impress her. She knew he would never examine the vendor invoices too closely. He was too consumed with looking like a big shot. She effectively charged him a $25,000 premium just to show up at the altar. The cold calculation of it was staggering. Natalie was not merely a haughty, entitled bride. She was a financial predator. She had looked at my son, recognized a weak, insecure man performing wealth he did not have, and decided to extract every dollar she could before the inevitable collapse came. And she had funded that extraction with the very money I had given Derek to protect his pride. Do we have ironclad proof of these transfers, Curtis? I asked, my mind already moving towards strategy. We have the routing numbers, the time-stamped wire confirmations, and the destination account registry. Curtis answered without hesitation. The paper trail is airtight. She ran the money through a very basic shell company structure, but my team dismantled it in under an hour. She is not a criminal mastermind, Gerald. She is simply an opportunistic thief. I began moving back and forth across the kitchen, the hardwood floor creaking softly under my boots. The entire dynamic had shifted beneath my feet. Derek and Ntuli were not a unified front of arrogant elites. They were two desperate fraudsters, quietly stealing from each other. Derek had forged a mortgage to buy her a condo. Natalie had embezzled his wedding funds to build herself an exit. They were a house of cards resting on a foundation of mutual betrayal. Curtis, I said, stopping in the middle of the room. This changes everything. Yes, it does, Curtis agreed. We now have leverage over both of them. We have Derek on federal bank fraud and forgery. We have Natalie on wire fraud and embezzlement. We have the ability to bring criminal proceedings against both the bride and the groom. The question is how you want to handle this, Gerald. Do we hand the files to the district attorney right now and let the police move in? I thought about Derek standing on my porch threatening to paint me as a confused, abusive old man. I thought about Natalie screaming at the waitress and insisting I be seated in the back. I thought about the sheer contempt, the complete absence of basic decency they had both put on display. I did not simply want them arrested, I wanted them thoroughly dismantled. I wanted them sitting across from each other, fully reckoning with what they had each done. No, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. We do not contact the police yet. If we hand this straight to the authorities, they will lawyer up and drag it through the courts for years. They will spin their own version of events. They will blame each other. I want them to tear each other apart in front of me. What is the play, Gerald? Curtis asked, recognizing something in the set of my tone. Prepare 2 separate dossiers, I instructed, one containing every piece of evidence on Derek's forgery and the fraudulent mortgage, the second holding the wire transfer records and the proof of Natalie's offshore embezzlement. I want hard copies of everything meticulously documented and beyond any dispute. Understood, Curtis said. And then we invite them to the corporate office. I replied, a cold, grim satisfaction settling at the corners of my mouth. We get them into the boardroom. We let them believe they are coming in to negotiate a settlement over the venue penalty. We have them both in the same room, and then we drop the guillotine. That is a ruthless strategy, Gerald. Curtis observed a note of professional admiration working its way into his voice. You are engineering a complete psychological collapse before the legal hammer ever falls. They earned it, Curtis, I said simply. Have the dossiers ready by tomorrow morning. I am going to make a phone call. I ended the call and set the phone on the counter. The thick pressing silence in the house felt entirely different than it had an hour before. It was no longer the silence of a storm gathering on the horizon. It was the silence of a trap that had just been set with perfect precision. I picked up the phone again, scrolled to Derek's number, and pressed call. It was time to invite the bride and groom to their final reception. The next morning, the sky beyond my window was a flat, unrelenting gray, the kind that promises a storm but refuses to deliver. I was at my kitchen table working through my second cup of coffee. The house was absolutely still, broken only by the steady ticking of the wall clock. I had spent the last 48 hours methodically dismantling my son's life, and now I was waiting for the consequences to reach him. It was precisely 10 hours when my phone rang. I did not need to glance at the screen to know who it was. The frantic, uneven vibration against the wooden table said everything. I drew a slow breath and steadied myself before answering. Dad? The voice on the other end was a fractured, desperate whisper. A voice I had not heard since Derek was a teenager, scraped clean of all its arrogant posturing and manufactured confidence. I am here, Derek. I replied, my tone deliberately even giving nothing away. Dad, I need you. I really need you. The words tumbled out of him, rushed and verging on panic. Something is happening. Something is very, very wrong. The bank Heritage Federal, they called me this morning. They said there is a problem with a transaction. They said my accounts are frozen, all of them, and my credit cards are declining everywhere. I listened to his rising hysteria with a cold, settled detachment. What kind of problem with a transaction? Derek, I asked, feigning ignorance. I don't know, he cried out, his voice cracking apart. They wouldn't say over the phone. They just said it is tied to an internal fraud investigation. Dad, I don't know what to do. Natalie is losing her mind. She tried to use her card at a hotel, and it was declined. We can't even buy gas. I'm locked out of everything. He paused, a sharp intake of breath, cutting through the line. Dad, listen to me. I know I messed up. I know I was out of line at the wedding. The things I said, the things Natalie said, it was unacceptable. I was stressed, and I took it out on you. But I need your help right now. I need you to call the bank. Maybe you can sort this out. If anyone can straighten this up, it's you. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Even standing at the edge of total financial ruin, his first instinct was to work me into pulling him clear. He was attempting to trade a half-hearted apology for a ruined wedding in exchange for rescue from a felony. You want me to call Heritage Federal? I asked, keeping my voice low and carefully quiet. Yes, please, Dad. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them whatever they need to hear to get the accounts unfrozen. I promise I will pay you back. I will find a better position. I will scale back. I will do whatever it takes. Just please don't let this ruin me. I let the silence grow long and heavy between us, giving his desperation room to expand and fill it. When I finally spoke, each word landed with deliberate weight. I cannot call the bank and tell them it is a mistake, Derek. I said, my voice carrying through the empty kitchen. Because it is not a mistake. What are you talking about? His voice had shrunk to barely a squeak. I know about the secondary mortgage on your mother's estate, Derek. I said the words falling one by one, like stones dropping into still water. I know about the $200,000 line of credit, and I know about the forged signature on the application. There was no sound on the other end, not a breath, not a stir, not the faintest rustle of movement. It was the sound of a man discovering he is trapped in a burning building, with the exits sealed. I have seen the documents, Derek. I continued, my voice steady and relentless. You forced open my filing cabinet, took the deed information, and put my name on an application to buy a luxury condo for a woman who treats you like a personal cash machine. You did not simply disrespect me. You committed a federal crime. Dad, no, wait, please. The panic in his voice had curdled into something raw, pure, unfiltered terror. It is not what you think. I was desperate. Natalie was threatening to walk out if we didn't get that condo. I didn't want to lose her. I was going to pay it all back. I swear it. I was going to liquidate some investments and cover the loan before you ever knew. You do not have any investments, Derek, I said, cutting cleanly through his story. Curtis Halford ran a full forensic audit of your finances yesterday. You are completely insolvent. You have maxed out 7 credit cards, and you do not hold a single tangible asset to your name. You were never going to pay it back. You were going to let your mother's legacy be consumed to prop up your hollow facade. Dad, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. He was crying now, loud, ragged sobs reverberating through the phone. Please don't do this. If they press charges, I'll go to prison. I'll lose everything. You have to stop them. You have to call them off. I am the one who initiated the fraud investigation, Derek, I said, and I felt the words hit him like something physical. I filed the affidavit of forgery. I froze the accounts. You set this in motion, but I am the one who controls where it ends. His sobbing cut off sharply, replaced by a tense, shallow, hyperventilating breath. What do you want from me? He whispered. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the gray sky. The trap was fully closed, and now it was time to finish it. I want you to come to my corporate office tomorrow morning at 9:00 sharp. I instructed, my voice hard and without give. Bring Natalie with you. We are going to sit down in the boardroom and settle everything. Do not be late. I ended the call before he could get a word in and set the phone on the table. The quiet that returns to the kitchen was a different kind entirely. The storm had finally broken, and what remained in the air was something clean and sharp, the atmosphere of a final confrontation waiting to begin. I sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table on the 42nd floor of Peachtree Plaza Tower. The room was built to impose. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto a sweeping view of the city, but the atmosphere inside was cold and without mercy. Curtis Halford sat to my right, his posture perfectly straight, a sleek leather briefcase resting on the table before him. To my left sat Detective Pruitt from the Financial Crimes Division. He wore a plain gray suit and carried about him an air of quiet, absolute authority. The three of us sat without speaking, waiting for the elevator doors down the hall to open. The trap was fully set. I was about to bring the corporate guillotine down on the 2 people who believed they could dismantle my life and make off with my late wife's legacy. Precisely at 9:00, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Derek walked in, first Natalie a half step behind him. They looked completely out of their element in the cold corporate surroundings. Derek had on a wrinkled suit that suggested he had not slept in it so much as collapsed in it. Natalie wore a large pair of designer sunglasses, doing their best to conceal bloodshot eyes. She held her expensive handbag pressed tightly against her chest. Despite how exhausted and frightened they appeared, a faint flicker of arrogant hope still clung to them both. They had walked into this room, expecting a sharp lecture, followed by a financial rescue. They believed this was some form of family intervention. They assumed I had brought them here to dress them down, before writing a large check to unfreeze their accounts. Derek stopped midway into the room when he registered the 2 other men seated at the table. He looked at Curtis and then at the detective. His stride faltered. Dad, He began, his voice sounding thin and small in the cavernous space. Who are these people? I thought we were handling this between ourselves. We are handling it right now, Shirk, I replied, holding my voice perfectly level. Sit down, both of you. Derek pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs and lowered himself into it slowly. Natalie took the seat beside him, sunglasses still firmly in place. She crossed her arms and sat with the posture of someone deeply inconvenienced. Gerald, I hope this will not take long, she said, a thread of her familiar entitlement woven through the words. We have been through a great deal of stress this morning, and we need our bank accounts unfrozen immediately. I looked at the woman who had insisted I sit in the back row at my own son's wedding. I felt not a trace of pity. Natalie, I said quietly, the men alongside me are here to make certain every dimension of your stress is thoroughly recorded. To my right is my corporate counsel, Curtis Halford. To my left is Detective Pruitt. Derek swallowed. The sound carried in the silence of the room. Detective, he repeated the word, landing in his mouth like something bitter. Dad, why is there a detective here? I thought you said you were going to resolve the mortgage situation. I said we were going to settle everything, I corrected him. And in order to do that, we need to look very carefully at what the two of you have been doing with my money. I reached across the smooth mahogany surface and took hold of the first thick manila folder. I slid it the length of the table. It came to rest squarely in front of Derek. Open it, Derek, I instructed. Take a good look at the life you built. Derek extended trembling hands and flipped it open. Inside were high-resolution copies of the forged mortgage application. The fraudulent signature stared back at him from the page. The precise routing details of the 200,000 line of credit he had taken against his late mother's estate were marked in yellow ink. Alongside those records sat the full results of the forensic financial audit, page after page showing maxed-out credit cards and complete insolvency. Derek stared at the documents. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. Dad, please, he whispered, a tear sliding down his pale cheek. I can explain all of this. I just needed a little more time. I was going to make it right. What you are looking at is federal bank fraud. Derek, I stated, my tone entirely without mercy. You committed identity theft against your own father to purchase a luxury condominium you had no means to afford. Detective Pruitt has already reviewed these documents. He has the original bank statements. He has security footage of you accessing my filing cabinet. The bank has formally classified the transaction as a felony. Natalie leaned over and scanned the papers in Derek's folder. Behind her sunglasses, her eyes went wide. In that moment, she grasped the true depth of his ruin. He had nothing. The millionaire she believed she had married was a complete fiction. A man on the verge of federal prison. You idiot! She hissed, pulling away from him, as though contact itself was dangerous. You lied to me. You told me you were liquidating your cryptocurrency portfolio. You stole from your own father to buy my house. You are pathetic. Derek shrank beneath her words. Before he could find his voice, I lifted the second manila folder from the table. This one was noticeably thicker than the first. I set my hand flat on its cover. Do not be so quick to condemn him, Natalie, I said, pitching my voice to fill the room. My son is a desperate fool who committed forgery to impress a woman who holds him in contempt. But he is not the only person in this room who belongs behind bars. I slid the second folder across the table. It stopped directly in front of her. Natalie stared at it, her jaw tightening. What is this? She demanded, reaching for defiance, but her voice betrayed her with a tremor. Open it, I said. Natalie slowly lifted the cover. The top page was a printed spreadsheet with 5 specific wire transfers highlighted. The pages that followed contained offshore account registries and routing numbers. I watched her expression travel from indignant anger to unvarnished terror. She tore her sunglasses from her face, staring at the financial records that documented her complete undoing. When Derek came to me desperate for money to salvage his wedding, I gave him $80,000, I said, addressing the room. I gave it to protect his pride. Derek deposited those funds into a joint account and trusted you, Natalie, to pay the vendors. But you did not pay the vendors, did you? You systematically embezzled $25,000 of my money. You routed it through a shell company and moved it into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands, registered under your maiden name. Derek spun to face his new wife. His mouth fell open. What? He gasped, his voice fracturing. Natalie, what is he talking about? You stole the wedding money. You told me the caterer required enormous upfront deposits. She was skimming off the top, Derek, I told him. She knew you were a fraud. She could see the money drying up, and she decided to build herself a golden parachute using the funds I provided for your marriage. She robbed you clean before you ever walked down the aisle. Natalie slammed the folder shut. This is a violation of my privacy. She cried out, her voice shrill and cracking. You have no right to access my personal accounts, Gerald. You cannot prove any of this. Curtis Halford leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Actually, Mrs. Calloway, we have complete and irrefutable proof. Curtis said, his voice smooth and precise. We traced the digital footprint directly from the joint account to your offshore registry. The financial trail is beyond dispute. You committed wire fraud and grand theft embezzlement. The district attorney will have no difficulty securing a conviction. Derek seized Natalie's arm, his face contorted with grief and rage. You stole from me, he shouted. I destroyed my life for you. I forged my own father's name to buy you a condo, and you were stealing from me the entire time. Get your hands off me, you broke loser, Natalie shrieked, shoving him back. You lied to me from the start. You promised me a life of luxury, and you have absolutely nothing. I earned every cent of that money for enduring your pathetic lies. I settled back in my leather chair and watched the two of them tear each other to pieces. The grand illusion they had constructed together was in ruins. They were no longer a glamorous elite couple looking down on the rest of the world. They were two common criminals turning on each other the instant the trap snapped shut. The corporate guillotine had fallen, and it had severed every lie they had ever built their lives upon. They screamed across the table at each other, while everything they had imagined for themselves dissolved into nothing. Detective Pruitt rose from his chair. He reached behind his back and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic sound as they came free cut the room to absolute silence. Derek and Natalie froze, staring at the detective with wide, stricken eyes. The window for negotiations and hollow apologies had closed. The handcuffs rested on the polished mahogany surface. That single metallic sound had severed whatever thin thread still connected the bride and groom. Natalie scrambled out of her chair, putting as much distance between herself and Derek as the room would allow. She pressed herself against the floor-to-ceiling window, breathing in sharp, rapid bursts, and leveled a manicured finger at the man she had pledged herself to only days before. She fixed her gaze on Detective Pruitt and began speaking in a torrent, her voice soaked in desperation. You cannot arrest me, she pleaded. I had absolutely nothing to do with that forged mortgage. Derek manages all the finances. He lied to me from the very beginning. He told me he was a millionaire and I believed him. I am a victim of his deception. Derek stared at her, his face twisted into a mask of pure betrayal. You are a victim, he shouted, lunging a step toward her, before Curtis Halford rose and stepped into his path. You drained the wedding fund. You stole $25,000 from the money my father entrusted to us. You were building yourself a golden parachute while pressuring me into buying you a $200,000 luxury condo. You demanded that specific unit, Natalie. You said you would call off the wedding if we did not move into that exact building. I committed forgery to give you what you wanted. Natalie crossed her arms, her eyes bright with contempt. I demanded the lifestyle you promised you could provide. She shot back, her voice bouncing off the glass walls. I did not tell you to commit a federal crime. Your pathetic inability to generate real wealth is not my responsibility. You are a complete fraud, Derek. You stole from your own father because you were too weak to build anything on your own. Derek drove his fist down onto the conference table. And you are a common thief, he roared. You embezzled from the very man sitting across this table. You stole money that was meant to pay the caterers you humiliated at the reception. You think the police will let you walk free because you claim you were deceived. You routed stolen cash to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. That requires premeditation, Natalie. You are going to prison right alongside me. I settled back in my leather chair and watched them tear into each other. It was a brutal, wretched display of self-preservation. There was no loyalty between them, no love. Every trace of their elite power couple image had evaporated entirely. They were like two rats on a sinking vessel, clawing and snapping at one another just to keep their heads above the waterline. For years I had watched Derek pretend to be something he was not. I had watched him adopt a sneering, manufactured arrogance to fit inside Natalie's hollow world. Now that counterfeit world was caving in, and they were going for each other's throats to survive. Detective Pruitt remained perfectly still, hands resting at his belt, and let them confess their crimes to one another in a room full of witnesses. Every accusation they hurled across the boardroom was another piece of evidence for the prosecution. Curtis Halford wrote steadily on a legal pad, capturing each admission of guilt. Natalie began to cry, real tears of panic cutting through her expensive makeup. "Gerald, please," she said, swinging her attention back to me. "You have to understand my position." I was terrified. I found out Derek was deeply in debt just weeks before the wedding. I moved that money because I needed a safety net. I was trying to protect my own future. I will give it back. I will wire the $25,000 back to your account right now. Just please tell the detective to let me go. I looked at her tear-streaked face. The woman who had proudly banished me from my own son's wedding was now appealing to my mercy. "You cannot return money to buy your way out of a felony, Natalie." I said, my voice quiet and absolute. "The crime was committed the moment you initiated the fraudulent transfer. You stole from my holding company to enrich yourself." Derek let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Don't bother begging him, Natalie," he said, his eyes burning with resentment. "He has been planning this since the night of the reception. He wants to watch us go down. He is enjoying every second of this." "I am not enjoying this, Derek," I said, my tone dropping into a heavier, more somber register. "It brings me no pleasure whatsoever to watch my son destroy himself. But I will not stand between you and the consequences of your choices any longer. You chose to commit bank fraud. Natalie chose to commit embezzlement. You constructed a marriage on a foundation of mutual theft. There is one final matter to address before Detective Pruitt takes over." I announced, drawing a third and final document from my inner jacket pocket. I laid it flat on the mahogany table. Derek and Natalie stopped arguing and fixed their eyes on the paper. Both of them hollowed out every last trace of arrogance wrung from them. "When you forged my signature to secure that mortgage, Derek, you had the funds wired into an escrow account managed by a luxury title company," I explained. "You used those funds to complete the purchase of your penthouse condominium in the downtown district. You moved all of your furniture and belongings into that unit 2 days before the wedding." Derek nodded slowly, his chest laboring. "Yes," he muttered, "that is my apartment." "It is not your apartment, Derek," I said flatly. "The title company you used is a subsidiary of my private holding corporation. When the bank froze the fraudulent escrow funds yesterday morning, the title company immediately voided your purchase agreement." Natalie drew a sharp breath and stepped forward. "What does that mean?" she demanded. "It means the deed to that luxury condominium has reverted to the parent company," I said, holding her panicked gaze. "It means my holding corporation owns the apartment you are currently living in, and since you have no valid lease and no legal ownership, you are officially trespassing on my corporate property." I slid the paper across the table. It was a formal immediate eviction notice. "You have 0 days to vacate the premises," I told them. "My security team is at the condominium right now, boxing up your personal belongings. The boxes will be left on the sidewalk. You have no access to the building. You have no home. You have no money. You have nothing." Natalie covered her face with her hands and let out a loud, agonizing wail. She collapsed into one of the leather chairs, completely broken. Derek stood motionless, staring at the eviction notice as though it were written in a language he could not read. The reality of his total ruin crushed whatever defiance he still had in him. He had tried to steal my legacy to purchase a counterfeit life, and now he stood with absolutely nothing left. The heavy quiet of the boardroom was broken only by the sound of Natalie weeping softly into her palms. Detective Pruitt moved with practiced efficiency. He came around the mahogany table and approached Derek. Derek did not attempt to run or argue. There was nowhere left to go and no lie left that could help him. He simply stood, shoulders caved inward, looking like a hollow version of the arrogant man who had entered this building 30 minutes ago. Pruitt took Derek's arm, turning him around with quiet but firm authority. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked sharply as they locked around my son's wrists. That sound rang off the glass walls, marking the definitive end of his fraudulent life. Pruitt recited the Miranda rights in a calm, measured voice. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Derek kept his head down. He did not look at me. He did not look at Natalie. He fixed his gaze on the carpet beneath his feet as the detective steered him toward the heavy glass doors. Just before they crossed the threshold, Derek stopped. He turned his head slightly, one final pathetic glance cast back over his shoulder. I gave him nothing in return. No anger, no pity. Only the steady cold gaze of a man who had at last removed a toxic infection from his life. Pruitt guided him forward, and they disappeared down the long corridor toward the service elevator that would carry my son down to the police cruiser waiting below. I turned my attention to Natalie. She was still in the leather chair, wiping her ruined makeup with a trembling hand. She watched Derek go, and a brief flicker of relief moved across her face. She believed she had survived. She told herself that because she was not leaving in handcuffs today, she had somehow come out ahead. She gathered up her expensive designer handbag and got to her feet, trying to pull together whatever remnant of dignity she still possessed. "I will be contacting my own lawyers," she said, her voice unsteady but reaching for defiance. "You cannot simply throw my belongings into the street. I have rights." Curtis Halford closed his briefcase with a crisp snap. "You have the right to leave this building immediately, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice entirely without warmth. "You are not being arrested today because the district attorney is still assembling the federal wire fraud charges against you. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. The indictment will be arriving by mail very soon. And do not attempt to access that offshore account in the Cayman Islands. My forensic team handed those routing numbers directly to federal investigators. The account has been frozen and seized. You have zero access to the money you stole." Natalie swallowed hard, her hand gripping the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She turned toward the door, desperate to get out of that room. "Before you leave, Natalie," I said, and her feet stopped cold. "There's one final matter to settle." She looked back at me, eyes still wide with the terror that hadn't quite left them. "The $82,000 penalty for the ruined wedding reception hasn't gone anywhere," I told her. "Since you and Derek signed that venue contract together, the liability falls equally on both of you. My collection agency will be coming after your future earnings, your assets, your bank accounts relentlessly. You walked into my life demanding luxury, and you are walking out with nothing beyond what's on your back and a crushing debt owed to the very people you treated with contempt." She parted her lips to protest, but the sheer weight of her situation strangled the words before they arrived. She had no husband left to drain. She had no high-end condo waiting for her return. Her standing among her circle of elite acquaintances would be obliterated the moment the embezzlement and the eviction became public knowledge. She was stepping out into cold city streets without a single dollar to her name, not even enough for a cab. She turned and practically sprinted out of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind her, sealing everything closed. I stood alone in that quiet corporate suite, alongside my lawyer, listening to the sound of her frantic footsteps disappear down the corridor. The guillotine had dropped, and the execution was flawless. 6 months went by since those glass doors sealed her out. The turning of the seasons had carried a crisp autumn chill into the air. I sat on the wooden porch of my modest single-story home, both hands wrapped around a heavy stoneware mug of strong black coffee. The neighborhood lay quiet and still, exactly the way Evelyn and I had always cherished it. The rustle of leaves drifting down from the old oak in the front yard sounded like a soft murmur of approval. I drew a slow sip of coffee and let the warmth move through my chest. All that chaotic noise, the arrogant demands, the toxic entitlement, had been cleared entirely from my life. It had been cut out clean, and the healing was coming along remarkably well. The legal battles had resolved exactly as Curtis Halford had predicted. The fraudulent secondary mortgage was entirely expunged from the public records. Evelyn's sacred farmhouse estate in the country was safe and untouched beyond the reach of the greed that had tried to swallow it whole. Derek was currently serving a federal prison sentence for identity theft and bank fraud. He'd appealed for leniency, but the judge was unmoved by his tears. Natalie had taken a plea deal to stay out of federal prison on the wire fraud charges. She avoided a cell, but every stolen dollar was stripped away, and she was now working a minimum wage retail job in another city, grinding away at the $82,000 restitution she owed my holding company. They had wanted wealth without effort, and what they had earned in return was absolute ruin. I felt no grief when they crossed my mind now. No residual anger, no resentment. I had grieved the loss of my son long before all of this, the moment I understood that the boy I'd raised had been hollowed out and replaced by a greedy stranger. What remained now was only a deep, unshakable stillness in my chest. I set my coffee mug down on the small wooden table beside my rocking chair and reached over to unroll a thick cylinder of heavy paper, pressing the corners flat with 2 smooth stones. They were architectural blueprints, The detailed schematics laid out a sprawling modern facility, ringed by open green spaces and community gardens. The bold lettering across the title block read, "The Evelyn Callaway Community Center." I ran my fingers along the blue lines tracing the interior. There was a large commercial kitchen built to offer free culinary training to underprivileged youth looking for a real career path. A substantial workshop wing was dedicated to teaching trades carpentry, plumbing, the kind of skills that build a life. It was a place designed to create genuine, tangible futures for people willing to put in honest work. The exact opposite of the hollow, glittering country club world that Derek and Natalie had worshipped. I had directed my corporate board to set aside a major grant to fund the full construction and operational endowment of the center. I was finally turning the vast resources of my holding company toward honoring the woman who had helped me build every last bit of it from the ground up. Evelyn never had any interest in imported crystal centerpieces or expensive tropical getaways. What she cared about was lifting people and giving them the means to stand on their own. When those doors swung open, her real legacy would live on in every person who learned a trade and carved out a better life for their family. I rolled the blueprints back up and eased them into their protective casing. I leaned back in the rocking chair, listening to it creak softly against the porch boards. I looked down at my faded chambray work shirt and my scuffed leather boots. I had no need for a tailored tuxedo to prove anything about myself. I had no need for a luxury condominium to feel grounded. Real class is not something you put on, and respect is not something you can buy with a stolen credit card. I had come up through poverty. I had built a corporate empire from scratch. I had endured the deepest possible betrayal from my own blood. And I had walked straight through that fire with my integrity still intact. I took one last sip of coffee, watching the morning sun climb over the quiet rooftops of my working-class neighborhood. I was a man who needed absolutely nothing from anyone else. And that is where Gerald Callaway's story comes to rest. Not in bitterness, not in celebration, but in the steady, unhurried quiet of a man who never stopped knowing who he was. This road cost him something real. It cost him the version of his son he had believed in for decades. It cost him years of grief he wore quietly long before any courtroom ever got involved. But I believe God does not waste that kind of pain. The Lord's timing may feel slow when you are sitting in the middle of the wound, but looking back, Gerald's patience was not weakness. It was the very thing that preserved everything worth preserving, including Evelyn's estate and his own good name. Here are the lessons I carry from this story. Never sign what you have not read, and never trust a signature that is not yours. If someone tries to use your age or your gentleness against you, let your record speak louder than their accusations. Protect what the people you loved helped you build. That is how their legacy survives. And remember, real authority does not announce itself. It simply acts when the moment arrives. These grandpa revenge stories stay with me because they remind me that dignity is not fragile, it is durable, and it outlasts every scheme thrown against it. Stories like Gerald's are the father stories. I think we all quietly need proof that a man can be decent his entire life and still find the spine to draw a firm final line. If this story moved you, drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they mean more than you know. Share this with someone in your life who could use a reminder that patience and integrity still win. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people who deserve it.